My husband abandoned me at the airport on our honeymoon day, but when I discovered where he spent those 7 days with his ex-wife, I filed for divorce, and they never saw how fast I left them behind. I'm 29 years old. I work in digital marketing, and I need to tell this story because what happened about 6 months ago basically destroyed my marriage before it even really began. And when I say it destroyed it, I'm not exaggerating even a little bit. I'm talking about how my honeymoon, which was supposed to be this perfect moment I'd remember my whole life, ended up becoming the most humiliating and heartbreaking week I've ever lived through. But anyway, I guess I should start from the beginning so everything makes sense. Because the truth is, the signs were there from way before. I just, like an idiot in love, decided to ignore them all. I met David about 3 years ago at a business conference. One of those super boring ones where everyone walks around in their pretentious suits drinking cheap wine and pretending they care about networking. He worked in corporate finance, one of those guys who's always glued to their phone answering emails at 11 at night like the world's going to collapse if they don't approve a budget before midnight. From the start, I found him attractive. You know, in that busy, successful man sense that makes you feel special when he pays attention to you. And the truth is, at the beginning, he did pay attention to me, or at least enough for me to think this could work. He'd take me to nice dinners when he could, send me sweet messages between meetings, and basically made me believe I was important to him despite his crazy schedule. What I didn't know at that moment, or what I didn't want to see because I was too invested in the relationship, was that David had never learned to set boundaries between his personal life and everything else, especially when it came to his ex-wife, Catherine. Catherine. God, just writing her name gives me this mix of rage and exhaustion. David and she were married for like 4 years before I appeared on the scene, and according to what he told me when we started dating, the divorce was super friendly and civilized because they simply realized they wanted different things in life. She wanted to travel and focus on her freelance graphic design career. He wanted stability and to build something more traditional, blah, blah, blah. All that story that sounds so mature and reasonable when you hear it. What David always emphasized was that they were still very good friends, that it didn't make sense to cut off all contact just because the marriage didn't work out, and that I had to understand that Catherine was an important person in his life. And I, being the understanding and modern person I was trying to be, would tell him yes, of course, that I thought it was great they could maintain a healthy friendship after the divorce. How stupid I was, seriously. During the first 2 years of our relationship, the interactions between David and Catherine seemed relatively normal to me. I mean, they'd text each other every now and then. He'd help her with tax stuff or legal things because she's a disaster with that kind of stuff, and occasionally they'd have lunch together to catch up. I tried not to be the jealous and insecure girlfriend who forbids her partner from talking to his ex, because honestly, I hate that stereotype, and I've always believed in trust and open communication. But looking back, I should have paid more attention to certain details that definitely weren't normal. For example, Catherine would call him at any time of day when she had a problem, like, it could be a Sunday at 7 in the morning because she couldn't open a PDF file she needed to send for a project, or a Friday night because her computer was making a weird noise and she needed someone to come check it out. And David always responded, interrupting our dates, our conversations, our plans, to attend to whatever Catherine needed. When we'd been together for about a year and a half, I started bringing up to David that it made me a bit uncomfortable, how frequently Catherine turned to him for everything, and that I felt she should be building her own support network instead of depending so much on her ex-husband. David would listen to me with that patient, condescending expression that now makes me want to slap off his face when I remember it, and would tell me I was misinterpreting the situation, that Catherine simply trusted him because she knew him well, and that he couldn't just abandon someone who had been so important in his life just because he was with me now. He made me feel like I was the irrational one, like the problem was my insecurity and not the fact that he clearly hadn't cut emotional ties with his ex. But I loved him, you know? And when you love someone, you do these ridiculous mental gymnastics to convince yourself everything's fine, that you're the problem, that you just need to be more understanding and give it time. Last year, around this time in November, David proposed to me at a super expensive restaurant with an ocean view, one of those places where the menu doesn't have prices, and you know you're going to spend the equivalent of a month's rent on dinner. It was romantic and perfect, with the ring I'd been dreaming about since we started talking about getting married. And obviously, I said yes through tears of happiness, while all the restaurant diners applauded. I called my sister Bethany immediately after, literally from the restaurant bathroom because I couldn't wait. and she got super happy for me, although she later confessed she always had her doubts about David because of how workaholic he was. My parents were excited too, and David's parents as well, everyone making plans for the wedding and talking about how beautiful our life together would be. We planned a relatively small and intimate wedding for October this year, so like a month and change ago. We didn't want anything too elaborate because we both work full-time and didn't have the time or energy to organize those giant events that last all day. We invited about 80 people, close family, and important friends, and the ceremony was in a beautiful garden outside the city. It was a beautiful day. I'm not going to lie. Everything came out perfect, from the weather to the food. And when David looked into my eyes during the vows and promised to love me and prioritize me above everything else, I really believed he meant it. We danced until late, toasted with champagne, and left for the hotel feeling like the happiest couple in the world. We had a honeymoon planned in the Bahamas, 2 full weeks at an all-inclusive resort where we could finally relax and enjoy being married without the pressures of work and daily life. This is where everything starts going to shit. And when I say to shit, I mean it literally. Originally, we were going to leave for the Bahamas 2 days after the wedding. But David told me like a week before the marriage that he had a super important meeting with a new client the morning of the day we were supposed to take the flight. He swore the meeting would be short, like an hour max, and that he'd get to the airport with plenty of time for our flight that left at 2 in the afternoon. I wasn't happy about this, obviously, because it seemed ridiculous to me that he couldn't postpone a meeting for our honeymoon. But he convinced me that this client was crucial for his career and that if he didn't close this deal now, he'd lose a huge opportunity. So I ended up accepting, telling myself it was just an hour, that it wasn't that big a deal, and that we'd have 2 full weeks for ourselves after anyway. The day of the flight came, and I was at the airport around 11 in the morning, super excited with my suitcases and my cute travel outfit, waiting for David to arrive. The plan was for him to go straight from work to the airport with his suitcase that he already had in the car. Noon came, and nothing, no message from him. I was starting to get nervous, but told myself the meeting was probably running a bit long, and he'd arrive soon. At 1:45, I sent him a message asking where he was, and he didn't respond. At 1 o'clock, I called him, and he sent me straight to voicemail. At that point, I was already starting to panic because our flight left in less than an hour, and David still hadn't shown up or answered me. I kept calling and sending messages, feeling the anxiety tighten my chest harder and harder, until finally, at 1:20, I received a text message from him. The message said, and I swear I have it burned into my mind word for word because I read it like 50 times, unable to believe it. It said something like, "Kimberly, I'm so sorry, but I'm not going to be able to take the flight. Catherine had an emergency and needs my help. I promise I'll make it up to you and we'll find another date for the honeymoon. Please try to understand." I stood there in the middle of the airport with my phone in my hand, surrounded by people running from one side to the other with their suitcases, and felt like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water over me. Catherine? His ex-wife, Catherine? Was he telling me he was going to cancel our honeymoon that we'd been planning for months because his ex had an emergency? I immediately responded, asking him what kind of emergency was so serious that it required him specifically to attend to it, and his response made me want to throw my phone against the wall. Turns out Catherine had twisted her ankle going down the stairs of her apartment that morning and called him crying because she couldn't walk and needed someone to take her to the hospital. A twisted ankle. It wasn't a car accident. It wasn't a serious illness. It wasn't anything that justified my husband of literally 3 days, deciding to abandon me at the airport on our honeymoon day. I wrote back asking him why she couldn't call a friend, a family member, a damn Uber, to take her to the hospital, and he responded that Catherine was very scared, and specifically asked him to help her because she trusted him. In that moment, something inside me just broke, and it wasn't just sadness or disappointment, it was pure raw fury. I responded something like, "You know what, David? Have fun taking care of your ex-wife. I'm leaving alone," and turned off my phone. Tears were running down my face, and people were looking at me with that expression of pity that makes you feel even worse, but I was already beyond the point of caring what strangers thought. I called my sister Bethany, who lives in another city about 2 hours away by plane, and between sobs I explained what had happened. She exploded, obviously, started yelling at me over the phone that David was an asshole and how dare he do this to me, and told me to change my ticket and fly to where she was instead of going alone to the Bahamas. So that's what I did. I canceled the resort reservation we'd paid between the two of us, like $3,000 that obviously weren't refundable, changed my ticket for one to Bethany's city, and boarded the plane feeling like the most humiliated person on the planet. During the flight, I didn't stop crying, and the lady sitting next to me offered me tissues and asked if I was okay. I told her the whole story because at that moment I needed to vent to someone, and she looked at me with this mix of indignation and compassion and told me I deserved so much better, that no man who really loved me would do something like that to me. She was right, of course, but at that moment I was still in that state of shock, where you can't fully process what's happening. When I got to Bethany's, she received me with a huge hug and a bottle of wine, and basically let me cry and vent for hours while telling me David was an idiot and she always knew something was wrong with him. That night, after drinking like half a bottle of wine by myself because I needed to drown my sorrows somehow, I decided I wasn't going to sit around crying while David played nurse with his ex. Bethany convinced me we should go out to a club that was near her apartment, and although at first I didn't feel like anything more than getting in bed and disappearing from the world, I eventually accepted because I thought maybe distracting myself would help. We got ready. I put on a tight black dress I'd bought for one of the nights at the resort and was now going to use to dance at a random club, and we left. The music was super loud, there were tons of people dancing, and after a couple more drinks I started feeling a bit better, or at least temporarily forgetting how miserable my situation was. Bethany started taking photos and videos of me while we danced, making me pose and laughing, trying to cheer me up, and in a moment of pure rage and desire for revenge, I decided to send some of those photos to David. I wanted him to see that I wasn't going to sit around crying over him, that if he could choose his ex-wife over me, I could go out and have a good time without him. So, I sent him like 3 photos of me dancing and smiling at the club, with a message that said something like, "Enjoying my honeymoon, thanks for asking." It was immature, I admit it. It was petty and vindictive. But at that moment, I felt powerful and justified. I wanted it to hurt him as much as it was hurting me. He didn't respond that night, or the next day. And honestly, I was too busy processing everything with Bethany and trying to decide what I was going to do with my marriage to worry much about his silence. But on the 3rd day, I received a call from my mom, and her tone immediately put me on alert. She asked if I was okay and what I was doing, and when I asked her why she was asking with that tone, she told me David had shown my parents and his parents the photos I'd sent him, and everyone was very disappointed in me for being so insensitive and selfish. Apparently, David told them his version of the story where he was just being a good friend helping Catherine in a medical emergency. And I was the cruel wife, who not only didn't understand, but on top of that went partying to make him feel bad. I got furious, like literally shaking with rage. I explained to my mom the complete story. From the beginning, including all the years of David prioritizing Catherine over me, all the times he interrupted our plans for her, all the red flags I'd ignored because I loved him. I told her Catherine had friends, had family, had options, but she always chose to call David because she knew he'd always respond. I said David was a workaholic who barely dedicated quality time to me, who was always glued to his phone, answering emails and taking calls even during our supposed romantic dates, and that this Catherine thing was just the straw that broke the camel's back. My mom was quiet for a moment and then admitted she'd noticed David always seemed distracted when we were all together, but assumed it was just because of his stressful job. I had the same conversation with my dad, with David's parents, with some close friends who'd heard David's version first. It was exhausting having to justify myself and explain over and over why what he did was wrong, but I needed people to understand I wasn't the villain of this story. Some supported me immediately. Others said we probably both had some fault and should go to couples therapy, and a few still thought I was exaggerating and being dramatic. But honestly, at that point, I didn't really care what people thought. What mattered to me was that my husband had abandoned me at the airport on our honeymoon day for his ex, and then had tried to make me look like the bad guy to our families. During that whole week that was supposed to be my honeymoon in the Bahamas, David didn't contact me a single time. 0 calls, 0 messages, nothing. I stayed at Bethany's house, working remote from her apartment and basically existing in a state of emotional limbo where I didn't know if my marriage was over or if we were going to be able to fix this somehow. Bethany told me every day I had to leave him, that this was emotional abuse and he clearly was never going to change. But part of me still had that foolish hope that maybe he'd realize what he'd done and come apologize and promise things would be different. At the end of the week, I decided I had to go back home, to our apartment we shared, even if just to face the situation and have a serious conversation with David about our future. I took a flight back on Sunday afternoon, feeling nervous and anxious about what I was going to find. When I got to the apartment, the first thing I noticed was it was an absolute disaster. There were dirty dishes in the sink, clothes thrown everywhere, the bed unmade, and a weird smell of old food that made me want to vomit. David wasn't there. His keys weren't in the bowl where he always left them, and clearly he hadn't slept at home in days because the bed was exactly as I'd left it before going to the airport. I sat on the couch and sent him a message asking where he was, and this time he did respond. His message said he was on his way and we needed to talk. He arrived like half an hour later, looking tired and disheveled, with several days' beard growth and huge dark circles. We sat in the living room, and for a minute neither of us said anything. We just looked at each other with this horrible tension floating between us. Finally, I asked him where he'd been all week, and he, with the calmest face in the world, told me he'd been at Catherine's apartment taking care of her because she couldn't move much with her injured ankle and needed help with basic day-to-day things. The whole week. He stayed the whole week at his ex-wife's apartment while I was emotionally destroyed at my sister's house. It wasn't just that day he took her to the hospital, but the full 7 days of what was supposed to be our honeymoon. I asked him if he was completely crazy, if he really didn't see anything wrong with what he'd done, and he responded that Catherine needed him, and he couldn't just abandon her when she was vulnerable and hurt. I screamed at him. And when I say I screamed, it's because I really lost control. That she wasn't his responsibility, that I was his wife, that we'd just gotten married literally a week ago, and that he'd chosen to spend our honeymoon playing house with his ex. David got defensive and started saying I was being irrational and insecure, that he was just helping a friend in need, and that my exaggerated reaction was exactly the reason he hadn't contacted me during the week because he knew I was going to make a drama. A drama. He called it drama, that I was devastated, because my husband abandoned me at the airport. At that moment, I knew there was nothing more to discuss, that this had no fix, that David was never going to understand what he'd done wrong, because in his twisted mind, he was the good hero, helping others, and I was the jealous and insecure wife who didn't understand him. I got up from the couch, grabbed my suitcase that was still by the door, and told him I was leaving. He asked me where to, and I responded that to my parents' house, that I needed space to think and couldn't be in the same place as him at that moment. He didn't try to stop me, didn't apologize, just sat there watching me leave as if I was the one being unreasonable. I drove to my parents' house crying the whole way, and when I got there and told them everything, including that David had stayed the whole week with Catherine, my dad exploded. He said he was going to go talk to David and tell him exactly what he thought of him, but I asked him not to, that I was going to handle this my way. That night I could barely sleep, turning over in my head everything that had happened, all the signs I'd ignored, all the times David had made me feel like I was the problem, when clearly the problem was him, and his inability to set boundaries with his ex-wife. The next morning I called a lawyer specializing in divorces and scheduled an appointment. My mom asked me if I was sure this was what I wanted, if I didn't prefer to try couples therapy first, but I was already sure. I wasn't going to waste more time of my life with someone who made me feel like a second choice, like someone less important than his ex-wife and his job. The divorce process was surprisingly quick and clean, mainly because David didn't even contest it. My lawyer told me it was rare for someone to simply accept all the conditions without fighting anything, but apparently David was so convinced I was the irrational one that he thought it was better to let it go without complications. We divided our assets, which anyway weren't many because we'd barely been married a month, and that was it. Like, 2 weeks after I filed the papers, I received an email from David, his first direct communication with me since that horrible conversation in our apartment. The email was basically a manifesto about how I'd DDSLDSE and ruined our marriage by being insecure and not being able to handle his friendship with Catherine. Just about how he'd always been honest with me about his relationship with her, and I'd accepted at first but then changed my mind. And about how he hoped I could work on my trust issues before entering another relationship. I read it once and deleted it immediately. It wasn't even worth responding to. The divorce was finalized like 3 months ago. I quit my job because I couldn't stand the idea of staying in the same city where everything had happened, and I permanently moved in with Bethany, who helped me get a position at the company where she works. I sold or gave away most of my stuff from the apartment I shared with David, including the wedding dress I only wore once, and that now made me nauseous to see hanging in the closet. My parents eventually supported me completely, although I think my mom still has the secret hope that someday David will mature and will reconcile, but I've made it very clear to her that's never going to happen. David's parents sent me an apology letter like a month ago, saying they finally understood my perspective and were very sorry things ended that way, but respected my decision. I haven't spoken to David again since that email, and honestly, I have no interest in doing so. I know from some mutual friends that he still goes out with Catherine occasionally for coffee or lunch, still being the perfect friend who's always available when she needs him. And part of me wonders if they'll eventually end up together again. But it's not my problem anymore. I don't have to worry about being the third wheel in my own relationship anymore. I don't have to compete for my partner's attention with his ex-wife. My life now is simpler, quieter, and although it still hurts when I think about everything I lost and what was supposed to be my future, I know I made the right decision. Bethany says I'm much happier now than when I was with David, and I think she's right, although I'm still in the process of healing completely from all this. What I do know is that the next time I fall in love, I'm going to pay much more attention to the red flags, and I'm not going to ignore them just because I want things to work out.